Alright guys, so this Karman Corp Fnatic game was probably some of the finest drafting cuisine that the LEC currently has to offer, and I wanted to break down just a little bit as the refinements that teams like Karman and Fnatic have been making in order to kind of be in that upper echelon and kind of unlock layers of Fearless Draft that I think currently not many other regions are deploying. I think in a best of 3 format as well, it's not necessarily the most complicated thing in the world, because let's say, for example, hypothetically, the series ends in 2 games rather. There's not really much room for discussion there, right? It's just like game 1 is a very normal draft, and then game 2 you can just make a minor adjustment based on what's gone. Really, the dynamics of Fearless Draft get really intense as you get into 5-game series, and that's when you really get to cook. In 3-game series, it's kind of just like you're forced to play more than one style, and that generally ends up being what happens. And I think as a normal test, I think it's pretty good to force teams to do that. Jumping onto this game, basically this is the current formation of how drafts evolved in this current meta still. I don't think it's too different. I think the main interesting take that was taken in this is actually from Karman Corp being able to ban out the Gwen themselves. Normally you command a lot of force on the blue side because it's pretty much instant B1 for you if you're interested in playing that champ at all. Gwen's always a champ that like threatens that sort of B1 environment if she's good, because she works in basically any draft. She has a very solid sort of matchup spread, and she doesn't really have many issues with a lot of different things, right? So surprisingly, I think it's just because Kana probably most likely does not have the comfort, and then a lot of the draft ends up playing out like very normally, right? Fnatic end up responding with priority Varus Zyra. Vi's gone, so there's not much to take there. Karman Corp, obligatory Ezreal response. Some teams are willing to mismatch it, but they have chosen not to, and then they go for the Azir counter pick. Otherwise, Fnatic are going to ban 2 Azir counters. Then Fnatic obligatory Ambessa counter pick into the Karman Corp Jace. So you basically have an even draft and forced into a normal environment. This could be what Karman Corp were looking for though, right? Because obviously spoiler alert, they did win this game and they are pretty happy with a lot of these trades, I would imagine. So that's essentially what happens here, right? So they ban a lot of, like, let's say spicy picks here, and I don't think it's really not like the craziest draft in terms of environment, right? So Fnatic, they sense that with the Azir sort of like winning matchup type beat, they pre-pick Wukong on 4 because they might sense that Karman Corp might have to go for a bit of more of an aggressive route. So it's a bit of a good read. They call it the Nefiri jungle. I really like the use and slots of the Nefiri jungle here, by the way, guys. I wanted to separately point that out because teams were just straight up slamming it, B1, R1, R2 even, and I think that was a misunderstanding of Nefiri's role as a champion. It's kind of completely understandable because she's a completely new champion to the role and to the meta, and it's a very different dynamic, right? It's an assassin, it's jungler. It's also it affects a lot of different things, right? It affects the slots and the order of priority. And it also affects the compositions that you can play around. So Karman Corp correctly identify and diagnose and give the respect that the Nefiri pick needs in order to kind of thrive. It's not something you can just slam. It's kind of like a coveted pick and a comp defining pick. She's still an assassin. There's a lot of champions and a lot of compositions that would give her a lot of trouble. She thrives in environments with a lot of chaos. There needs to be a lot of cases where there's not just solid overall front to back and a lot of durability from the enemy lines. There needs to be champions to identify and be able to pick off as well and thrive from a lot of the roaming that she brings to the table. And this makes a lot of sense why they're picking in this case. And there's a lot of consequences from having to go for this environment. This is why it's set up from Kana B1ing Jace, right? Normally, a lot of top laners demand a lot of resources. It's very common. You want counterpick. You want to pick as late as possible, right? You want to blind something that's relatively. You want to blind something a little bit later. You don't want to get cooked, right? It's the hardest lane to get cooked in, and Karman Corp have done a really good job of defining that. And I think this is what gives them a good advantage in the first game. In the second game, it is a very interesting take as well. You can see Fnatic, like, they're not willing to just go down without a fight, and they go for a B1 Zyra, and with a lot of the standard front to back champs gone, we move on to the second layer of them, and then Fnatic end up going for the Zyra because their goal is to force the environment of a draft into a certain way, right? When you pick Zyra and you go really high pacing, high tempo jungle like this, it's normally not allowed. But it is something that gives Karman Corp a lot of like obligation to respond to, right? If you're G2 here, you're instantly slamming Mundo. I do think it's one of the better counter picks that teams can bring to the table. I think there's other things you can cook that people were willing to go for. You see a lot of the similar bans, by the way, so it sets up the Zyra to be able to be picked B1. You know, you can pick those like normal facilitator junglers, but people feel scared. You know, you make one mistake, Zyra gets out of control. She gets so much tempo. She gets really out there, right? So that's why Fnatic are picking strong lanes to go around it. And I think Karmine Corp also make a small blunder here. It's not necessarily because they mistreated a certain champion. I just think it could be their perception of the meta and how they feel like it would pan out. So in this example, they go for R1, R2, Ashe Corki, right? Makes sense in terms of the Corki pick. I'll allow that because it gives them a decent priority on mid lane. But then the Ashe pick is, in my opinion, she's one of the more overvalued champions of the patch at the moment. Even in spite of Ezreal Varus being banned, and I believe Kalista is still banned. There's other champions that I think teams could be trying. I'm sure like. They could try Lucian, they could try Jhin as well, they could bind MF themselves. There's a lot of things they could go for, right? And on paper, yes, Ashe commands a lot of power in terms of laning phase, and that's why she's generally pretty coveted. But I think overvalued as a champion. I believe she's just overvalued as a champion overall. She's just too weak on the patch. You inspire her champion identity, being able to command lanes. It's like she's just not bringing enough to the table right now after her nerfs. So it's really hard to really justify this, especially when you're forced into that Zyra environment. Pair this with the Braum. It makes sense. This is something that makes sense on paper with the counterpick into something like MF. But Braum gets self-countered by Rel, by the way, because Rel has True Engage and can take his resistances and whatnot. So it's not something that I was the biggest fan of, right? And now, especially when you have a Zyra already, because now even when you pick Braum on B3, R3 rather, and then on paper it makes sense because you have Corki and you're playing Pogue, but you're facing against a composition that can easily, very, very easily, at the drop of a hat, just play your game and do it better, because Zyra is just so many resources. And Karmine Corp are going to pick something spicy in jungle because they move it to R4, R5. And Fnatic basically end up removing the most problematic options, let's say. Fnatic basically have a non-answer because there's not really much else their comp needs to really do, because they've already won the draft at this point. It was just on Karmine Corp to basically answer, and Karmine don't really have an answer on 4-5 because they already essentially defined what their comp was doing on R1 through R3. So that's basically why this was such a problem. Draft 3, now there's not really defensive options left, and I love this because now we're throwing everything at the wall. It's just become a full aggressive draft. You can see how this shifted You can see this shift in the priorities in the bans as well. Look at this preemptive Draven ban from Fnatic as well. It's really cool that they're really able to read the situation. Karmine Corp ban out the Vi. They're not willing to be one. And this opens up the draft to be a lot more spicy, right? I'm surprised Karmine Corp banned Galio and then leave Rumble open, by the way. You can see they understand that Kana is more of like a weak side player, but they're not willing to play the consequences around it. It's kind of weird in my opinion. It could be they're hitting the limit of what they think they could actually pilot in terms of the draft, right? If you're gonna ban Galio and you're not willing to play Rumble, then it basically tells me you're not willing to play both sides of this matchup, which is a little bit strange in my opinion. Especially in a meta where knowing this matchup is effectively crucial for top lane in this environment, right? We're seeing a limit as to players, with small champion pools or certain specific styles. You can't really get away with that anymore. You have to be able to, pilot more than one thing at a time, and you kind of see them slowly get punished over this. Rumble Kaisa makes sense, right? You're basically setting yourself up for a priority target, and you can Karmine Corp correctly identify that this is basically the basis of the draft. Going Xayah into Kaisa is a very classic sort of environment, it's a very classic counter pick. She tries to go forward into you. Xayah tries to answer. Rakan is gone, by the way, in this draft, so it is just Xayah in isolation, but Xayah Nautilus into Kaisa Leona is basically peanut butter and jam in terms of bot lane matchups. So this makes total sense in my eyes. But alternatively, I would have actually liked Karmine Corp to probably go Tristana flex on like 2-3 here. They could have threatened that because Tristana does really well into Kai'Sa in this environment as well. And this is something that I think let's call this a missed opportunity from Karmine Corp in a sense. So Fnatic just keep going forward. Pantheon is basically the second layer of high priority junglers in terms of facilitators, especially with Jarvan and J4 ban. And you can kind of see Karman Corp are just drafting. It's like a non-answer draft. I always don't like these drafts because they're always based off of like drafting to not win and basically gave Fnatic all the picks they needed, right? It's just you get priority pick Rumble and now you get whatever counter picks you want on 2 through 5. And it's a bit of a shame because it was such a strong draft to start, but now they're just doing Band-Aid. This draft was more of a Band-Aid draft. And basically, what was all this for? A Maokai B1, right? So I think, nonetheless, I do think both teams had really good glimpses of like what optimal drafts in this environment look like, at least from a best of 3 format. And I wanted to kind of highlight that. So hopefully that made sense to you guys. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.